here with you this afternoon. We are officially recording the meeting, just so you know. But today's training and webinar is going to focus on sexual violence in detention and providing victim services for incarcerated survivors. Just so everyone is on the same page, there is room for participation in this webinar. The slides with Black backgrounds typically host a poll. You do not have to participate, but feel free to use the chat function as well, especially towards the latter half of the presentation. We will get going here. So if you wouldn't mind, we're going to launch our first poll. So tell us where you work. Are you an advocate, a counselor, a nurse, social worker, attorney, law enforcement, corrections, government, educator, or ethics? All right. So I'm seeing some advocates, seeing some social workers. All right. Seeing some educators, others. We'll give this poll about 5 more seconds and we'll close the poll. Thank you all so much. That's really helpful for me moving forward. All right, so our next poll, we will move on to tell us if you provide services to survivors in confinement. So does your agency provide services to incarcerated survivors in a facility? Does your facility have victim advocates who provide services? Or does your agency not work with survivors who are incarcerated? Or does your facility not work with victim advocates? All right, so we're seeing a little bit of a mixed bag here. So a lot of agencies who are providing services in jails or prisons, a lot of facilities who have in-staff victim advocates, then a lot of folks who aren't working with this population. All right, so I will end this poll. And stuff. So today, for our learning objectives, just to quickly get going so you know where we're headed, we're going to review the PREA standards and highlight victim services specific standards. By the end, it's my hope that you understand how to use the PREA standards as a tool for providing survivor-centered care. Also going to discuss trauma-informed care when working with survivors who are incarcerated. And then towards the latter half, there are some scenarios where I'm hopeful that we can build and practice some of those more tangible crisis intervention skills that we can apply to our work immediately. But again, this is not PREA in depth on those standards specifically. Just a quick note about language. I want to highlight my own use of language throughout this webinar. I'm going to use victim and survivor interchangeably. Victim is the term used in the PREA statutes, so I'm reflecting that back. You might also see the language of inmate or prisoner. Prisoner typically refers to someone who is incarcerated, and inmate is occasionally the language that the government will use. Regardless, when you're working with survivors, it's always a best practice to reflect back the language that they are using. So moving on to victim services and the PREA standards themselves. Today's training is going to focus specifically on the victim services standards rather than the PREA standards generally. Q1's training focused on all of the standards. I'm going to briefly highlight some key aspects, but this training really focuses on relevant ones for rape crisis centers and community mental health providers. So our next poll here, this is sort of a knowledge check for you all, but who is required to implement the PREA standards? Is it only federal and state prison facilities? All correctional and law enforcement facilities? Or is it rape crisis centers and the facilities in their service? So feel free to participate in that poll when it pops up. Looks like it might not be popping up, so feel free to pop in the chat if you know. Oh, there we are. Okay, so who is required to implement the PREA standards? It's looking like most folks are putting all correctional facilities. Yep, only federal and state prisons. Excellent. So, end the poll here just quickly. So the vast majority of you are correct. The PREA standards, all correctional and law enforcement facilities are required to implement the PREA standards. It's really important to remember that implementation and compliance with PREA is not on rape crisis centers. Rather, it's on those confinement facilities. Just to briefly cover the different types of facilities you might be working with. Within PREA, there are different sets of standards for different types of facilities. Federal law states that individual states, such as Maryland, could potentially stand to lose federal funding if they don't comply with PREA. More specifically, 5% of federal funding for corrections may be lost if states are out of compliance with PREA. Some states have opted out altogether. Others have certified that they will use that funding to become compliant or are in the process of compliance. But closing out this poll, the 4 different types of facilities are jails, prisons, community confinement facilities, and juvenile facilities. So federal prisons typically house people after they have been convicted and house inmates generally that have a sentence for about a year or above, typically felony convictions. And then prisons are typically managed by federal or state governments. Jails tend to house people who are waiting for trial or in that pre-conviction phase. Or they might house people who have shorter sentences under a year. And those are typically managed by a county or a city. Lockups are managed by local law enforcement agencies for a short period of time. So within that, community confinement and community correctional facilities are a bit harder to define, and they can take many forms. So you might hear things around community confinement, including halfway homes, restitution centers, mental health facilities, drug or alcohol rehabs, and other sort of community corrections facilities. So that means that typically individuals reside in that facility as part of a term of imprisonment or as a condition of their release. So they're slightly different than those jails and prison systems. They might also include things like employment support, vocational training, treatment, education, or other sort of re-entry supports. And then lastly, you'll see juvenile facilities, which house incarcerated people who are under the age of 18. Again, 4 different main types of facilities, each with a different set of PREA standards. Now, the standards within those do look similar, but for juvenile facilities in particular, the standards look a little bit different. Just going to let the interpreters. All right. So from here, I just want to highlight again, if you get anything out of this presentation, is that PREA applies to all corrections agencies. The PREA standards are not binding on rape crisis centers or other community advocates or community mental health providers. And then additionally, it's the responsibility of corrections agencies to implement PREA, to comply with PREA, and to participate in audits to prove compliance. Now, rape crisis centers may be a part of that work and that compliance, but the responsibility lies with the agency. And then lastly, under PREA, corrections agencies are required to attempt to establish a memorandum of understanding or an MOU with local rape crisis centers or other victim service providers. Now, if your rape crisis center does not have an MOU with a local agency, that does not mean that you cannot provide services to incarcerated survivors. It is very much on the part of individual correctional agencies, though, to work towards establishing that MOU. And if you need support in that work, Stephanie and I are happy to help facilitate that discussion and work towards building an MOU. So moving towards the facility's responsibilities within PREA. Obviously, the sets of standards are rather long. I want to keep this high level, but the responsibility to keep people safe lies with a given facility. They are also charged with protecting survivors from abusers and perpetrators. So part of that looks like preventative action, typically screening for risk of victimization, and also sort of that response piece that we'll review later. Facilities should be providing multiple ways to report sexual violence while incarcerated. That includes things like the reporting hotline, reporting in writing, reporting to staff in person, and anonymous reporting. Per PREA, survivors should have access to both reporting services and confidential advocacy on the part of the facility to ensure that survivors have both of those pieces. And again, this is really where we start to come in. Facilities need to be offering medical and mental health care to incarcerated survivors. That typically expresses itself in the form of a sexual assault forensic exam. PREA also seeks to increase accountability for offenders so that we know what's happening in a given facility and we can seek to address sexual violence and create facilities that have a culture of sexual safety and safety in general. Part of that is through data and auditing you can look at yourself, but facilities are audited every 3 years. Additionally, there are statutes in place that address what needs to happen when sexual violence occurs on the part of staff. So thinking about that staff collaborative, coordinated response. And then PREA, a major piece of PREA is that facilities need to be providing survivors access to victim services. They should have access to victim services the same capacity that survivors in the community would have access to advocacy and confidential victim services. So PREA seeks to bridge that gap in a given facility. So highlighting the victim services standard, I want to highlight specifically the accompaniment piece by an outside advocate. So I'm going to read to you the language of this standard so that you know what it is. It says, the agency shall offer victims of sexual abuse access to forensic medical evaluations, whether on site or at an outside facility, without financial cost, where medically appropriate. Such examinations shall be performed by a sexual assault forensic examiner. If possible, the agency should be documenting access to that safe. Additionally, the agency shall attempt to make available to the victim a victim advocate from a local rape crisis center. So again, the big parts of this particular statute is that accompaniment piece. So agencies have to be providing survivors with a victim advocate, and they also have to be providing access to that forensic exam piece. Additionally, that advocacy piece should look similar to what a survivor in the community would receive or have access to. So things like advocacy during the exam at the hospital, advocacy during investigatory interviews, and then all of those really great things that advocates do already. So emotional support, crisis intervention, safety planning, intervention and referrals, potentially ongoing case management and therapeutic work. PREA sets guidelines around survivors having access to that, and this standard really seeks to address that. The next standard here is access to outside confidential support services. So again, the facility shall provide inmates with access to outside victim advocates for emotional support services related to sexual abuse by giving inmates mailing addresses and telephone numbers, including toll-free numbers where available of local, state, or national victim advocacy or rape crisis center organizations. The facility shall enable communication between inmates and these organizations and agencies in as confidential a manner as possible. So high level, that means that survivors should have access to outside confidential support services. Base level, so the floor of this, not the ceiling, is that a facility must provide access by mail or phone to an outside rape crisis center or other advocacy organization. Additionally, they are obligated to inform incarcerated people of any limits to confidentiality. I'll go over that piece later in the training, but again, the purpose of this standard is to provide inmates with access to that emotional support service. Access to outside support is important because inmates may be reluctant to seek emotional support from within the facility. Some facilities may lack the resources to be able to provide that support. And we know that survivors, whether incarcerated or otherwise, can really benefit from a trained advocate who can help support them in their safety and in their healing process. So moving on to the limits of confidentiality under PREA. So the facility is obligated to seek to enable reasonable communication between inmates and these organizations or agencies in as confidential manner as possible. Now, what does that mean in practice? We all know confidentiality is one of the major pieces of advocacy and one of the major benefits, having someone to speak to who is not going to report on your behalf. But within PREA, that can become difficult and often confusing. But facilities should be working towards that confidential advocacy piece. It's important to know if you're an advocate at an outside agency, meaning a non-corrections agency, your reporting requirements are the same as if you were serving or working with someone who wasn't incarcerated. So your reporting requirements are based off of your state reporting requirements and any sort of professional or ethical board requirements you may have. So if you're a social worker or a therapist, you fall under those reporting requirements. And those look different than folks who work in corrections. And it's important to be able to communicate that both to survivors and correctional staff. Just a few other pieces for you before we move on. Advocates, again, follow the same confidentiality standards as they would in the community. It's important to know that PREA also applies to prior incidents of abuse. And that can include incidents of abuse that happened before a survivor was incarcerated. So if a survivor experienced sexual violence before they went into a given facility, they should also continue to have access to that outside support. And then additionally, PREA can be used to help support survivors experiencing sexual harassment. I know sexual harassment is an umbrella term, but PREA does not just apply to those experiencing rape or physical violence. It also includes sexually harmful behavior that may not meet the barriers for getting a forensic exam. So it's important to know that you can provide that confidential advocacy piece for those who are experiencing sexual harassment as well. So moving on here to victim services in an incarceration environment. How can we use the PREA standards as a tool for providing services? So our next poll, if you're ready and feel so moved, based on the PREA standards and some of what I just said, in what setting do incarcerated survivors have the right to an advocate? During a sexual assault forensic exam, an investigatory interview, for emotional support via phone, for emotional support via email, mail, or in person, or all of the above. Thanks. I'm testing your abilities here towards the latter half. Nice. Everybody is seeing me put all of the above. Yep. Wait. So the poll is going to close here shortly, but yes, the answer is all of the above. So advocates can provide support in any and all of those contexts per the PREA standards. All right. So thinking about when you might engage with a survivor who's incarcerated. So when do incarcerated survivors engage with victim advocates? So first, you want to think about, did the survivor report the sexual assault? How are they coming into contact with you? How are they walking into your services? If they did report the assault in whatever capacity, they have the right to an advocate during the forensic exam, at any sort of investigatory interview, and they have the right to an advocate for that emotional support piece. And that can look a bunch of different ways, but typically that's via the phone, email, mail, or in person. Now, if a survivor did not report their sexual assault, they would still have the right to an advocate, but it would look a little bit different, right? Because they're not getting a forensic exam or they're not going through that investigation piece, the majority of the advocacy support is going to come from the phone, mail, or email. So you will typically engage with an incarcerated survivor at the time of a forensic exam. If they were to call the 24/7 hotline via mail, and then if your agency is providing in-person services. I'm going to highlight these 3 settings and transition into more tangible advocacy skills in these settings. So when you're working with a survivor at the time of a sexual assault forensic exam, what does that look like? So per the PREA standards, they have the right to an advocate. Again, incarcerated survivors need the same basic support during an exam that survivors in the community do. So an exam for an incarcerated survivor is very similar. The exam protocol is the same. The 15-day collection window is the same. The order of the exam is the same. So the narrative piece, collecting DNA evidence, swabbing, photography, those options are all available and they look the same in practice. Some exams may take place at a correctional facility, but typically they take place at a hospital. And then I do want to flag a few things that might be a little bit different in this setting. In my experience supporting survivors in a forensic exam setting, a survivor may be in restraints, and you want to think about before the exam begins how you're going to navigate that. Additionally, a correctional officer will more than likely be present at least the hospital, if not in the exam room or in the vicinity. The survivor may be handcuffed, they may be restrained. How are you going to talk through that as an advocate and work through that? But again, I want to name that just as you would in the community for a community survivor, advocacy skills are the same. They don't go away and they don't change necessarily because somebody is incarcerated. So just like you would in a typical forensic exam, you want to inform the survivor and staff of who you are. What's your role? What help can you provide? Why are you there? What are you doing? And then generally across the board, best practice, we want to know the protocols before we get called. So you want to know how am I being dispatched? How am I arriving at the hospital or a given facility? It is so stressful. It's difficult work already, and you want to be prepared for it so that you can mitigate some of that stress. So you really want to understand how all parties will be informed of the need for accompaniment. Are they calling you? Are they emailing you? What does dispatch look like? Are you dispatching the forensic nurse? Are they dispatching you? You want to know where you're going, how you're getting there, all the basic things that strong advocacy includes. Another thing you want to think about, you want to brainstorm with the survivor, but also before you get to the exam, how you're going to start to create that privacy and confidentiality. So what does it look like to have a one-on-one engagement and provide that confidential support when there's a correctional officer? How are you managing the logistics of the room? Where is your body? Where is the survivor's body? Where is the nurse, the correctional officer? These are all conversations that you want to have before you get dispatched, and then work through any issues when you're dispatched. That preparation piece, my experience, has mitigated a lot of personal anxiety, but it's also moved the process along in a way that's much smoother for everybody. I can talk about best practices and things that have worked for me in the past around confidentiality. Sometimes simply asking the correctional officer if they would be willing to step to the hallway where they can hear, or they're in eyesight of the survivor, but they're not involved in the exam. They can't view the exam in real time, has worked for me. Additionally, thinking about building confidentiality around sound, using sound machines, using doors or curtains to your advantage. So if a correctional officer has to be in the room, can we shut the hospital curtains and use a sound machine? So while they are in the room, they're not hearing our conversation. I know this is less than ideal, but thinking about this before you get dispatched is really important. And then, just like you would in a community case, talk to the survivor about what they can expect during an exam. Explain the exam as a menu of options. Nothing is required. Per PREA, this is really important. Survivors can get a Jane Doe or an anonymous exam. So they can get that forensic evidence piece collected, but they do not have to report who did this specifically to them. Additionally, they can deny or accept any of that prophylaxis treatment, just like a community-based survivor would. And then closing out the interaction at a forensic exam can be really difficult in general, but especially with this population. We, of course, want to talk through safety and safety planning, and we will do that towards the end and brainstorm some ideas around that. But you want to prepare the survivor for their return to the facility. You want to ask about their concerns. And if they're amenable, think about helping them through making that plan. You want to consider suggesting coping skills that they can use in a detention facility, but also just generally, right? You want to be realistic about the coping skills you're suggesting and safety planning in general. One of my big frustrations sometimes with safety planning is that we will suggest things that survivors don't want to do or can't do or can't access. So really being thoughtful about our suggestions, and if they're welcome, not everyone wants to safety plan. Really thinking through what that looks like. When I'm working with survivors in the hospital who are incarcerated, sometimes it's helpful for me to think about it as if it were cases that included domestic violence, because more than likely, our planning together is going to include the potential reality that they will be near and around their abuser. So planning through that and talking through that, advocates are equipped to safety plan with domestic violence survivors. Those skills are the same, it's just a different context and environment. And then finally, I can list out some safety planning ideas. We will do that later. But most important here is that you have actionable follow-up. So who are they calling? Are they calling? Are they emailing? Are they calling you directly, your hotline? Do they know that number? Can you provide that number? You also want to think about potentially including an ROI or a release of information. Now, per the Violence Against Women Act, that release of information has to be informed time limited, and obviously the survivor has to consent to it. That can be an important piece in continuing that ongoing advocacy and ongoing relationship with a survivor. So we don't want to have a situation in which we serve a survivor in the hospital and then we can't get in touch with them after. So really thinking through the logistics of that. So we've covered what an exam might look like. I want to cover what an investigatory interview might look like. Incarcerated survivors, again, have the right to an advocate during an investigatory interview. For those of you doing legal advocacy, you can easily adapt some of those skills that you already have. But when it comes to investigating sexual abuse in detention, typically you'll see two parallel investigations: the administrative investigation and then the criminal justice system investigation, or the criminal investigation. Administrative investigations are typically conducted by the facility themselves, and then criminal justice investigations are held and conducted by law enforcement. It's important that, just like in a forensic exam, you communicate your role. Why are you there? What support can you provide? Typically, this piece is held within a given facility. I would really encourage you, if you are going in person, to look at the facility's requirements on their website around dress, things you cannot bring in and out of the facility, and really being prepared and thoughtful in that, because they can deny you access. And some of the rules may seem arbitrary, but it's important to know them before you go. Additionally, if you've never sat in on a law enforcement interview, just so you know, they're typically recorded. So understanding your role once the recording starts. In my experience, once the recording starts, an advocate is no longer speaking. You can encourage the survivor before the interview to take breaks as they need to and advocate for themselves. But once that recording begins, we really are not speaking. And then investigators who are conducting that admin investigation piece may not be used to working with advocates. So being able to explain your role, services you can provide, how those services benefit the survivor and their investigation can be a really helpful piece in getting your foot in the door. If you're used to supporting survivors in that criminal investigation piece, the advocacy looks very similar. It's just a different setting. You want to think about asking specific follow-up questions. So questions around timeline. When will the survivor be getting updates? Who will be communicating those updates to the survivor? If the survivor isn't hearing anything from the agency, who do they contact to ask for updates? They should always be updating them, and that's really where your advocacy can be particularly powerful and helpful. And then lastly, you really want to talk about that notification piece. So how is a facility communicating the outcomes of an investigation to a survivor? Because best practice, we want to prepare a survivor for what that might entail and what might come up for them in that notification piece. And then lastly, if you go in person, it's a great time to discuss confidentiality in their facility and build relationships in their facility. So thinking about working through potentially a tour, working through building that relationship, especially if you don't already have an MO. So we've done the forensic exam piece, we've done the interview piece. I want to talk about mail now. So written correspondence is one of the primary communication modalities with the outside world for people who are incarcerated. Frequently, it's a critical avenue for advocacy, right? Written correspondence is accessible for almost all prisoners and all people who are incarcerated. It's cost efficient, and when done well, can be very powerful and effective, particularly for those survivors who have no other way of getting support. Writing letters and writing in general offers a really great way to process and express feelings and emotions for survivors, and then for advocates to provide support, validation, resources, and emphasize survivor rights. Generally, we would recommend sending mail as classified mail or legal mail. That way, the letters will not be screened. If they are not classified as confidential or legal mail, letters will more than likely be read and screened. So you want to think about the content that you're including in those letters and safety planning around that, especially if the survivor shares with you that the perpetrator is a staff member. Not all survivors are ready to report, and we want a safety plan around that. So even if you can't get that confidential and secure mail status, you can still provide vital information and support. We just want to talk through that confidentiality piece with people. Regardless of confidential or not, we always want to prioritize safety, thinking about reading those letters carefully, responding to them in ways that are validating, generally using neutral language, especially gender neutral language, and then thinking about tangible skills in those letters. So what can we provide survivors with that they can use in real time? So written materials, I have seen things like journal prompts. I have seen advocates provide survivors with safety planning worksheets. Those worksheets are effective for some and not others, right? But using written correspondence as a tool for advocacy. I know this can feel different for those of us who have never done it before, but really using that simple, clear, respectful language and reflective language back to survivors. I'd be happy to provide you with Just Detention Centers International. They have a template for providing correspondence with incarcerated survivors, if that's helpful for folks. But again, this is a really important piece of advocacy because it's one of the most accessible pieces for incarcerated survivors. All right, so the last setting that you might engage with incarcerated survivors is on the hotline. For those of us doing hotline work, this is sort of the bread and butter of advocacy in many ways, but telephone systems in detention facilities tend to require prisoners to make either a collect call or to enter a PIN to pay for a call. The expense of calls from prisoners or for prisoners can be a real barrier and challenge for survivors who are seeking services. So if your organization does not accept collect calls, you want to think about developing that MOU piece or working through the logistics of how to make sure that your hotline is free and confidential. Additionally, maintaining confidentiality on a hotline call for an incarcerated survivor can be really challenging. Calls on the hotline may be monitored, and they may also be subject to time limitations. So when you get a call from an incarcerated survivor, you really want to think about those crisis intervention skills. So identifying the need of the survivor, prioritizing safety, and then actionable steps, especially if you are time limited. So knowing the protocol, being clear about confidentiality and safety, and then continuing to develop your own advocacy skills on the hotline. I feel like every time I work a hotline shift, I learn something new, or I realize that I need to work on a particular skill set. But thinking about, just like you would for a community call, those boundaries, those sort of actionable steps and referrals that we make, and also managing expectations around a hotline call. Is it reasonable to expect solutions from a 15-minute hotline call? You should be able to talk through that with a survivor. So what are we tangibly doing on this call? Can we achieve it? And if not, what's a workaround, or what's something we're comfortable working through together? All right. So we're going to transition now to more sort of less me talking at you, more participation here. I want to talk about trauma-informed considerations. So moving away from the standards and how to use them as a tool to more tangible advocacy skills. So if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat rather than the Q&A, what skills, I'm going to hype you up a little bit and think about doing this from a more asset-based perspective. What skills do you already have that make you a great advocate? Like, as an advocate, what are you really proud of? What are you good at?
Grace, as folks are putting that in the chat, there is a question, if you are ready to answer it, about the last section.
I just see an okay, thank you.
I can read it out to you, so you don't even have to navigate it. It's from Tanya, and she's asking if incarcerated survivors are allowed to communicate using tablets. She said incarcerated people have access to tablets now, and are they allowed to communicate with them via messages with an advocate?
I've seen some variation here from facility to facility. I have heard of survivors in Maryland communicating with their advocate via tablet. It is my understanding that in some facilities, those tablets are taken away when a survivor is put in segregation. So I would not bank on having continued access to that tablet. I would have something in my back pocket as a workaround, but I have heard of survivors being able to access advocacy via their tablet. And then Tanya, I'll put my email in at the end if you want to follow up with me directly on that. I'm happy to. All right, friends, now I'm back on the chat. So what skills do you possess that you think make you a good advocate? Empathetic listening, yes. Active listening, compassion, empathy, active listening, genuine care and compassion, yes. These are all excellent. That active listening piece, that empathy piece, that reflective language piece, these are all advocacy skills that you can use with a survivor, regardless of the setting in which you work with them, right? So the skills that you already have that make you a great advocate, you're going to use in this environment, and they don't go away. So the setting might look different, but the skills and the values and the way that you live that out are the same. I think it can be really easy to get overwhelmed by the setting. I get overwhelmed by the setting. From a sensory perspective, it's overwhelming, let alone the gravity of the situation being overwhelming. It's been really helpful to me to remind myself that as an advocate, I have the skills and training to be able to support someone regardless of the environment in which sexual violence occurred. Now, that's not to say that each survivor is, each survivor has different needs and needs different supports, and advocacy is going to look different, but I have the capacity to serve people well. And I would really encourage you and empower you with that knowledge, especially if you feel confident in in a particular skill, leverage it. But again, all survivors deserve support in their pathway towards healing, regardless of the environment or situation in which the sexual violence occurred, right? And our ability to serve them and our capacity to serve them really should stem from that trauma-informed care piece. And I want to talk specifically about trauma-informed care, but I also want to think about other sort of theories and practices that have helped me. So I'm going to start this section from a more theoretical perspective, and then we're going to transition into scenarios. But I want to highlight the power over to power with model, the people and environment model, and then we'll talk about trauma-informed care. But when I think about sexual violence and sexual assault, we know that in order to fully understand it, we must, at least in part, examine sexual violence through a power and control framework. Those who have experienced sexual violence have experienced that power over model, meaning that the perpetrator has asserted power and control over their person. When I think about advocacy at its best, I think about a power with model, one in which providers, for the sake of this training, advocates will say, share power with survivors, right? It is a collaborative experience. I think it's really important as advocates to know and understand that at the beginning of an interaction, it's not an equal interaction, right? We have a lot of power as service providers when working with survivors, incarcerated or otherwise. Frequently, we have access to information and referrals that is simply put not equitable. So rather than that power over model or control model, I really think about advocacy as flipping that to a power with model. So in operating in this framework, we have to acknowledge the inherent power dynamic and authority we hold as providers. It is not an inherently equal relationship. Rather, we have to work towards collaboration. I think excellent advocacy really flips the survivor's experience from one in which they had a power over experience, the actual sexual violence, to a space of mutual collaboration, shared respect, and shared power. As advocates, we are not there to tell survivors what to do. Rather, we are there to hold and create space for survivors. So how do we do that? How do we encourage and create space for survivors and encourage them to make choices that are healing and empowering for them? For me, this is really apparent when I work with incarcerated people because they have such little control over their external environment. So I, as an advocate, how can I equip them with skills, knowledge, referrals, information to flip that narrative and flip that model to one where they feel that they have a greater sense of control? How do we do that in practice? I think it's much easier said than done, but this model really helps me think about, at least theoretically and from a values perspective, what I want to achieve as an advocate. And then from there, letting the survivor lead the way. What kind of advocate do I want to be? And how do I support a survivor in their agenda and their healing, right? Because it's not about what I want or my opinion really on their healing. It is about their process and being the type of advocate that is supportive of that. So the last sort of theory I want to highlight that has been helpful to me in thinking about working with survivors who are incarcerated is the people and environment theory. So when I get overwhelmed by the tangibles and deliverables and logistics of advocacy, this has really helped me. I think the person and environment perspective, its guiding principle, is highlighting the importance of understanding that an individual and their behavior, we want to situate that in their environmental context. So where they live and where they act. I think it's particularly helpful when supporting people who hold a marginalized identity, incarcerated survivors, survivors just across the board. Oh my goodness, my computer's updating everybody. Now it's not, sorry. But it's impossible to understand and support a person without truly understanding how they relate to their environment, right? So what supports and what influences do they have? And how can we leverage that? How can we use that in their healing process? This is also one of the theoretical backgrounds that's really helped me understand that survivors are the experts on their own lives, and they really lead the way in the interaction with an advocate. They are the experts on their environment and their influences and their support. That has really helped me when thinking about how to advocate on their behalf. All right, so now that we have some of that theoretical background, I want to go to some data. I want to highlight Maryland rates of incarceration. So when you're working with an incarcerated survivor, you have some background. In the US, there are about 2 million people incarcerated and about 3 million on probation. Sexual violence continues to be a serious problem in US detention facilities. Every year, roughly 200,000 adults and children are sexually abused or assaulted behind bars. And the majority of survivors are abused not once, but again and again. And again, this is just reported assaults. And about half of those are committed by staff, so people charged with keeping inmates safe. Sexual abuse happens in all different types of facilities, but it also occurs in both men, women, and children's facilities. So it's not unique to one type of facility. Currently, there are about 100,000, slightly above that, Marylanders behind bars. And that's in state prisons, local jails, federal, community confinement, and juvenile facilities. So of that number, the areas with the highest rates of incarceration are Baltimore City and the Southern Eastern Shore. So Baltimore City is home to about like 9 or 10% of the state residents, but is home to 40% of the state's incarceration population. So you can see disparities in geography in and of itself. And then if you compare Maryland's rates of incarceration to other NATO countries, it is staggering. So this graph compares Maryland incarceration rates to NATO countries. And interestingly, Maryland incarcerates 531 people per every 100,000 people. The national average is 664. So we're below it, but not by much. So thinking about breaking this down further, when we examine the incarceration rates in Maryland by race and ethnicity, we see that non-white people are incarcerated at much higher rates than their white counterparts. You can see on the graph here, there are 310 white people incarcerated for every 100,000, and then there are 1,437 per every 100,000. So again, that is a staggering gap. I want you to keep in mind the volume, but also the diversity within that. And then highlighting too that this is just the reported data. So when we talk about sexual violence in a given facility, that's what's reported. That might not reflect the reality of the number of incidents. I'm going to ask this group, our last poll before we close out, how surprised were you by the rates of incarceration? Were you very surprised? It's higher than I thought. Somewhat surprised, it's high, but about what you imagined, or not surprised at all? Right. So I will share on this one. I was somewhat surprised. I think I knew it was high, but not this high. And it seems like the group is with me. So we have a real sort of mixed bag here on this poll. Okay. So when we think about that people and environment perspective, I want to highlight the levels of trauma for folks who are incarcerated. Not only is being incarcerated traumatic, but when people come to a given facility, their rates of adverse childhood experiences and trauma is much higher than that of the general population. So I found this quote particularly impactful. When you study prison populations, you see a common preponderance of childhood trauma and mental illness. The two go together. This is from a documentary called Step Inside the Circle. And it was released in 2020, but it talks about the trauma of folks who are incarcerated and their experience before being incarcerated. I want to highlight that when we think about that ACEs score, about 64% of the US population has at least one adverse childhood experience in their background. Contrast that with 97% of people living in prison have at least one or more adverse childhood experience. So thinking about that, when I work with incarcerated survivors, sometimes the support that they want and that they need is not actually stemming from their experience of sexual violence in a detention facility. It's actually their support that they're seeking is from previous trauma or previous adverse childhood experiences. So really thinking about trauma across the lifespan and not just within sexual violence. You know, we are all familiar with the trauma-informed approach and what that looks like, but I do want to highlight those 6 principles because they transcend context, and I think they're very helpful when generalizing what we want to do, regardless of the setting. So first, safety. How can we create and hold space for physical, psychological, and emotional safety? How can we promote that? And we want to think about this as ongoing, right? Safety is not stagnant, it's dynamic. How do we build trust and transparency with incarcerated survivors? How do we avoid re-traumatizing? I can't make guarantees that I won't trigger someone, but I actively want to avoid that re-traumatizing piece. What does that look like? How do we build that peer support? So what support do they have in their community, in a facility, maybe family and friends outside? How do we think about that choice piece? Collaboration. So I think of collaboration over compliance. When I'm working with survivors, thinking about advocacy as a menu of options. I am suggesting things that can be denied as quickly as taken up. And then thinking about collaboration as survivor identified. So what are the goals that a survivor wants to achieve? My goals really are the survivor's goals. How do I connect them with relevant services and resources? Thinking about empowerment and choice. Can I give back some of that choice and autonomy that was taken from them? I think a lot about this in a forensic exam setting. So how can I help them in their decision-making process? Because it's theirs, not mine. How am I normalizing experiences or emotions? Am I sort of establishing a positive interaction? What does that look like? And how am I restoring that sense of control and co-regulation? And then lastly, I brought up all of these statistics and adverse childhood experiences because a big piece of trauma-informed care is that cultural relevance piece. So thinking about cultural, historical, and gender issues, right? Survivors come to us with a whole host of needs, but they also might be coming to us for support around trauma that's unrelated to sexual violence, right? We want to recognize the historical and cultural trauma that may compound their experience with sexual assault and be prepared to support them in whatever is coming up. Then thinking here more specifically about the crisis intervention piece. So no two survivors are the same. We don't treat everyone equally. We treat everyone as special and unique and with their own needs. And we want to meet survivors where they are. Otherwise, we as advocates can't be effective. And that transcends setting. So whether you're in a forensic exam, an investigation interview, responding to mail correspondence, right? We want to meet survivors where they are. Now, I've listed sort of the crisis intervention process here because the process doesn't change. How it looks might be different, sure, but it is the same, right? We want to identify the crisis. So understand the setting in which you're providing advocacy, and then thinking about next steps. I also want to note that I'm setting this up as a process. More often than not, I have found this to be incredibly cyclical. So we'll go in and out of the steps, but this is just an outline. So again, identifying the crisis, understanding the resources that are available to survivors and communicating to them how they can access them, empowering survivors to make informed decisions, and then thinking about how do we establish that belief themselves, right? Like, how do we provide that positive support? What does that look like? So first, breaking it down, you want to work through that rapport. So crisis intervention across the board is not successful. The person doesn't trust you and they're not comfortable with you. So that first impression piece does really matter. Second piece we want to think about is that assessment. So what is happening? What are the next steps, right? We want to pay attention to body language, tone on a hotline call. We want to figure out if the situation is acute or non-acute. Are they contacting you immediately after an assault? Is this 6 months later, a year later? Are they looking for support in reporting? Do they need forensic exam accompaniment? And then from that assessment, we can think about that intervention piece. So I'm going to work through the intervention piece on subsequent slides, but this is really like the core of advocacy. So using those de-escalation techniques so that the survivor is regulated enough to think through those decisions. We want to talk about resources, create an actionable plan that's realistic and doable. And then that last piece is that closure. So we want to talk through that plan, make sure we understand it, we are on the same page, and we have the right resources, the correct contact information, thinking about those referrals making sure they're accurate, right? One number that's incorrect in a hotline number will not get them to the right place. Reviewing and going over that. So moving into that intervention, resource, and safety planning piece. How do we safety plan with an incarcerated survivor? I'm going to name that I can get really overwhelmed with safety planning. It is a skill that I've had to develop, but I think it's important to remember that safety planning is one, ongoing, but two, framing it as risk management and a dynamic, ongoing conversation, right? Safety planning does not ensure safety, and not making promises about that. I know that can be difficult, but that transparency piece is really invaluable. Another thing that I would just highlight is you also want to ask if someone wants to safety plan. Not every survivor does. Ask them, like, is this something you want to talk through? And if yes, be prepared to explain what safety planning is. Like, how do you work through that language in real time? For me, I always talk about safety as meaning different things to different people. So it looks different for me, for staff, for my colleagues. And if you're having trouble getting the conversation going, or you just don't know where to start, what I would think about is asking a few key questions. So one, what is the survivor's main worry or concern right now? So that survivor-centered advocacy piece, identifying that. And then I would think about talking through the risks to the survivor. So what risks might they experience? Whether that's the perpetrator or just general life risks of being incarcerated or being a human being in the world. And then I would also ask them, what have they done in the past that's kept them safe and has worked? What won't they consider trying again? So if they previously safety planned, you can leverage some of that skill and that knowledge already. What do they see as helpful? It's one thing for us to suggest coping, grounding strategies, but if that's not helpful to them, they're not going to use it. So have them think about what is helpful to them. And if they can't come up with something, then we can, of course, have a discussion about suggestions, but really thinking about leveraging skills that they have already, right? And then lastly, what sort of resources or options can you offer? So this is really where your advocacy piece comes in. What referrals are relevant, actionable, and tangible? If they're not those three things, we probably shouldn't be making that referral. Thinking here again about evaluating survivors' needs and capacities, we want to think about survivor-defined safety and survivor-defined goals. So what resources are we able to provide? And then how does that intersect with the steps that a survivor is willing and able to take? If those things are not sort of within that Venn diagram, they are more than likely not very useful. So for me, when I think about providing coping skills or suggesting coping skills when safety planning, especially for this population, I think about access, ease of access. So can they access it in the environment in which they live and operate? And then do they want to? Like, is it helpful to them? So I'm going to throw this back to you all. I have a lot that I love and suggest with people and that survivors have told me have been very helpful to them. But what coping, grounding strategies have you all used with survivors in the past? I would, if you feel comfortable with the chat function, that would be great. But things and coping skills that incarcerated folks can access. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, as it requires no additional stuff except your senses. Yes, Lisa. Thank you for sharing that one. That one is a great one in a variety of settings, right? People can do that for free anywhere they are. While these are coming in the chat, I will share some that I have found particularly helpful. They're easy and they're not overcomplicated. When I'm working in the hospital with somebody, and if they're struggling to stay grounded, I will give them something to hold. So whether that is a glass of water, I've given, blanket, whatever, just something for their hands to keep them busy. Additionally, I have thought and used in the past ice. So playing with heat as a tool and as a grounding strategy. Most folks have access to that in the hospital. Additionally, we can use breath work to our advantage. So Lisa mentioned the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Other breath work, you don't want to overthink it. So the box breath, the 4 count inhale, 4 count exhale, very helpful. That 4 count holds. Another one that I really love, you support a survivor through 2 sharp inhales and then 1 really long exhale. If someone is really dysregulated, that sort of sobbing, it's really going to help them lengthen through their exhales. So 2 really sharp inhales, 1 long exhale. They can walk away with that. They can do that on their own. Additionally, other things that I will suggest, thinking in categories. So I'll name a category and we'll list out every single thing that we can think of in that category. Counting backwards, listing favorites. I know that sounds odd, but it also sparks conversation. So what's your favorite XYZ? And they'll just list their favorite. The other thing that I really love is the take 5 breath work. So I don't know if anybody ever done this one, but you put your hand in like a high 5, your pointer finger, you put your hand at the base of your wrist, you inhale and trace 1 finger, you exhale on the lower, and then you inhale on the next finger, exhale as you lower. By the time you get to the end of your hand, you've taken 5 deep breaths. You can also do that really without anybody noticing that you're doing it, and you can do it anywhere. Other coping strategies I've thought about for incarcerated folks: journaling, writing, reading. Some survivors have access to exercise or walking, movement-based things. That's not always available. Don't suggest it if it isn't available. Let's see. I just still talking about the survey, but really thinking about those tangible grounding strategies for survivors. So just some general final tips before we move into scenarios. Remember that you have the capacity, you have the skill set to work with survivors. You have the expertise. It might be an unfamiliar environment and system, but you can learn and educate yourself around that system and environment. This might not be a population that you're familiar with working with, but the skill set is the same. I also want to validate that it is really normal to be worried or nervous or concerned. It's normal to be anxious about this, regardless of the setting. Just as you work with survivors in the community, it's normal to be nervous. Reach out for support in that anxiety and talk through with either a supervisor or a peer some of your concerns around that. Also want to name that it's really helpful to have coworkers and peers to talk about your experience with in serving survivors across the board, but especially with this population. I have learned the most from working with my coworkers and learning from them about what has worked for them. We can brainstorm on best practices, problem solve together, use the resources and skills that you have access to already. And then these are all best practices, whether you're working with an incarcerated person or not. Process your experience being an advocate. This work is really heavy, and it is normal for a lot of things to come up that maybe you didn't expect to come up for you. So taking the time to process your experiences and your emotions, and not being hard on yourself about what's coming up for you, and talking through them, because you may have concerns that other people share, or you may have encounters that folks can learn from, and develop and hone your skills within that. I really believe that the processing piece for advocates is such an important site of self-care and self-maintenance, and continuing to do this work well. So if you are so inclined, we're going to run through two scenarios. I know we're butting up against time, but if you feel comfortable using the chat, that would be great. There are just two, and then we'll be on our way. So the first scenario, I'm going to read it loud. It's an in-person advocacy scenario. You are working as an on-call victim advocate and receive a call from your local hospital that a survivor is requesting an advocate during a forensic exam. When you arrive at the hospital, you learn that the survivor, Jane, is incarcerated at your local facility. She was brought to the hospital by a corrections officer after reporting her sexual assault yesterday. Before the exam begins, Jane is visibly uncomfortable and asks if the correctional officer will leave the room during the exam. So from here, she asks the nurse if she could have a few minutes to talk to you. And she wants to receive the exam, but does not want to disclose in front of the officer. How would you, along with support from the FME, offer Jane support during this scenario? What options are available to Jane before, during, and after a forensic exam? All right. So I will talk through this one. One thing that I will highlight is the need to work with the forensic examiner and the correctional officer. I know that can be really challenging, but thinking through how do we build that confidentiality piece? So can we talk through the logistics in the physical space? Can we work and ask the correctional officer to maybe move to an office space? Can we think about using the curtains or sound to our advantage? Additionally, ensuring that Jane is empowered with the knowledge that she can receive an anonymous exam, meaning that she does not need to report the specific person. Finally, I would also think about closing the interaction. So how, if at all, am I safety planning with the survivor? What does follow-up look like tangibly? Am I calling her the next day? Is she calling me? Do I have that release of information to make that communication happen? So those are just a few things that we could think through, but I would really encourage you to leverage the partnerships you have with the forensic nurse examiner, even including the correctional officer in that piece of support.
So Grace, we are at time. So sorry to interrupt, but our ASL folks are about to log off. So thanks for putting up your last slide. I also put the survey links in the chat. This last one is correct. A couple of them early on were incorrect. But before we log off, any last words in our last minute from you, Grace?
No, thank you all so much for coming. My email is on the slide. Thank you all for your participation. You are welcome to reach out with questions, and we will be sending out the recording.
All right, friends, thank you for joining us today. Thanks so much to Grace for all this amazing information. You'll be getting a follow-up email tomorrow, and have a great evening. Thank you.